Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Figge Art Museum's Virtual Thursdays at the Figge series. My name is Joshua Johnson, and I am the Assistant Registrar here at the Figge, and I also had the pleasure of working as the curator for the dimensional 3D objects from the Figge Collection. Tonight, we are going to focus on that exhibition, but before we do, I kind of want to talk a little bit about our Thursday night program in general. So first, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. As many of you will know, we host these Thursday night activities at the Figge almost every Thursday night, whether we are doing it virtually like we're doing it tonight, or we're having an in-person program like we did last week for the recent exhibitions that opened. So to give you a little highlight of what's to come here, we have on next Thursday, we'll have a virtual curator talk with Deborah Cullen-Morales, who partnered with the Smithsonian to curate the Robert Blackburn and Modern American Printmaking exhibition that's also on view here at the Figge. This program will begin at 6:30, just like the one tonight. I'm guessing since you all are in attendance tonight, you figured out how to sign up for these, but in case you haven't, all you need to do is visit our website and register, and that's where you can find out more about our upcoming programming as well. We are able to offer these Thursday programs at no cost to you, thanks to the generous sponsorship provided by Chris and Mary Rayburn. Chris and Mary, thank you so much for your continued support of the Figge and all that we do. We would also at this time like to very much thank the exhibition sponsors for the Dimensional exhibition, Mark and Barbara Zimmerman. So thank you guys so much. While these programs are free to watch, I do encourage you all to consider becoming Figge members. Your support as a Figge member is vital to the museum, now more than ever. Membership generates revenue needed to support exhibitions, educational programs for adults and children, care of the collection, and so much more. For those of you who are eager to visit the museum, I'm sure many of you have already done so in person, we recommend that you check out the Figge's website, which has all the information you need about what the kind of current requirements are for visiting, including mask wearing and so forth. Tonight, as I mentioned, we are going to be discussing the Dimensional exhibition. So this is an exhibition that's on view on the Figge's third floor and will be up through January 16th of 2022. So you guys have a lot of time to come and see it. So I really recommend seeing this one in person. A little bit more technical things to walk through tonight. If you do have any questions while I'm chatting or we're talking about the exhibition, please put those into either the chat or the Q&A function on your Zoom meeting or webinar. And I will respond to those as we're kind of going through, and most likely respond to a lot of them at the end, and I'll read the question out. We can all kind of deal with the question together. So what is the Dimensional exhibition? So you're looking at a photograph of what you would see as you kind of walk through the main gallery doors here, if you're seeing my screen, which goodness, I hope that you are. And so what this exhibition is comprised of is any work from the Figge collection that has a three-dimensional element. So we wanted to focus on sculpture, but also things like industrial design and decorative arts and things that had a more utilitarian purpose, but are also had a real kind of sculptural beauty to them. And so we were wanting to get as many kind of objects out as possible that maybe hadn't been on view in a long time, or in some cases decades, or hadn't been on display ever as part of the Figge collection. So a lot of recent acquisitions to the collection. So these are all works that are either from the Figge collection proper or from a private collection that is very much associated with the Figge. And so there are over 60 works on view. And to give you a little, this is giving you a little teaser in terms of the imagery in front of you, but there's a wide range of different, techniques and skills and materials being implemented in the works on view in this exhibition. And that's really how we kind of wanted to structure the exhibition. We're not structuring it necessarily based on imagery. We're not structuring it based on time period or artistic style. This is about how they're made. And so the way that it's grouped, it is separated into the four different, broad general classifications of sculptural assembly. So how are these things put together? So those four different classifications are carving, modeling, assembly, and also casting. So those are the sections that we're looking at. The one image we're looking at here is from the assembly section. So this is allowing for really a cross time period comparison of what these artists are doing with often, very different materials, but using the same kind of basic umbrella technique. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through examples from each of those 4 sections tonight and kind of talk about what is kind of unifying them, and also some things that are unique to the individual works that we're looking at on the screen. And so this was a really fun exhibition to kind of pull together, kind of pull from the depths of the collection and get some things out that maybe hadn't been seen in a long time. So, a lot of times when people are thinking of traditional sculpture, they're often thinking of maybe, the monument in the town square, which is cast in bronze, or they're thinking of the carved marble statue on a plinth. These are, while absolutely valid means of making sculpture, they're very traditional. And so one of the things that we really wanted to show here is not only the traditional art form of sculpture and also 3D objects, but also where has it come to? Where are we at right now, and how is that represented within the Figge collection in particular? Okay, so this is a little teaser image of what's in the exhibition. We will get back to talking about exactly what we're looking at here. I did want to kind of walk you through the exhibition in the order that you would see it if you were seeing it in person. So these are some of the works that are on view in the little orientation gallery before you enter the large gallery proper on the 3rd floor. So the first thing you'll kind of see as you come off the elevator is this large assemblage made by William Hawkins. William Hawkins is, of course, we'll all be familiar with from the exhibition that was here in 2018, is an Ohio-based folk artist who was often combining elements of whatever he was kind of finding in his studio, in his neighborhood, not only in terms of material, but in terms of imagery to create objects like what you see before you. And we're very, very fortunate. This is a recent addition to the collection. We're very fortunate to have this because there aren't that many of these sculptural assemblages by Hawkins that survive, and especially on this scale. So this is a real rarity, and we're so lucky to have it. This is Columbus Skyline. It was made in 1988. It's his rendition of the well-known Columbus landmark, the Vern Rife State Office Building. And so you can see here that he has constructed this pseudo skyscraper out of things like thin strips of wood, also kind of roofing tin, and then the sides are made of pretty beat up pieces of plywood, but also sections of what I think was wall that still have wallpaper attached to it, and like Formica wallpaper. And then the sides are also blanketed in all these kind of great collage images that Hawkins had sourced. One of my particular favorites is this, it's this little image from the Smithsonian magazine, I think, and it has this image of this peculiar looking dinosaur, and the caption reads, "Perhaps the sexiest of the dinosaurs," which is perhaps my favorite quote from any piece of artwork ever, because it's just so absurd. So look for that when you're coming to see this in person. But this is really, representative of Hawkins' technique of kind of bricolage, this idea that, making do with whatever you have around you. He has this great quote that he talks about, that if you aren't picking up the kind of cast off materials of other people, the kind of waste that was, that he was perhaps seeing on his walk throughout his community, he said, you're stepping over money. This idea that these materials still have value. And so that he was able to source these materials at no expense to himself, but then these materials bring the kind of history of whatever they were used for before into the creation of his works, like Columbus Skyline here. Now, this might seem an odd juxtaposition to have this, 1988 assemblage by a folk artist like William Hawkins juxtaposed with a cameo that is probably from the 19th century of Medusa here. But within that entry space, I really wanted to show the range of kind of what's available within the Figge collection right here in this community in terms of what can be done sculpturally. So of course, cameos are very much smaller. This is kind of an unfair way of looking at the imagery, because the Hawkins piece is, of course, like 92 inches high, whereas this cameo in actuality, while large for a cameo, it's only about 2 inches tall, although then, in this image, they look about the same height. But this is, of course, dating back to the Romans, this technique of carving hard stones, generally, semi-precious stones, often using a foot-driven lathe. So that's if you think of like a dentist drill, it's It's grinding away using a series of powders, but also other ointments to actually have an abrasive surface that the spinning mandrel of the lathe is actually boring into the surface of the stone, like the coral that we see in the head of Medusa here. And, you know, this is only one of 3 cameos that's in the display in the front area. But it really does kind of represent the range of materials these cameo carvers were able to use. We have an example of Poseidon carved out of shell appropriately. This one is out of coral, as I mentioned, of Medusa. And then the third one, continuing the kind of Greek and Roman mythology theme, is the head of a Bacchanate, who is the follower of Bacchus, the god of wine, which is carved out of ivory. So we don't have any of the traditional hard stones on view, but this is, again, a kind of a range of what's available. And like I said, we wanted to stick to this kind of Greek mythology theme. But really, the intricate detail that these sculptors were able to get using the, you know, a foot-driven lathe. And, you know, this whole tradition dates back to signet rings, which many of you will be familiar with. The Romans were basically carving into these hard stones so there was a recess, so that when they put their melted wax on top of their important documents, their letters, what have you, they were able to then take their ring, stamp it into this, I'm noticing you can't see my hand gestures, stamping into the melted wax that they had poured, and it would leave an impression of whatever had been carved into the recess of the stone on the ring, and that would act as kind of the official seal. That's how this tradition of cameo carving got started, and of course, you know, continues up to this day as a method of jewelry manufacture. So it's this idea of carving these, you know, intimate little sculptures using this technique of revealing different layers in the stone, or in this case, just making a sculptural head. I particularly love the snakes coiling out of the locks of her hair, intermixed with the wings on jutting out the side, revealing her Gorgon nature. Okay, so that was kind of the entryway. The first section you're greeted with is assembly. So assembly, we're using this term very broadly. We're not talking about assemblage necessarily, though there are lots of examples of assemblage in this section. We're talking about assembly as a broad umbrella term that means any time when you are putting multiple materials together and fusing them in some way. You know, there's examples of welding in this, there's examples of knitting in this, of sewing, of, you know, hammer and nail. There's all different range of techniques that's really just putting 2 different materials together and fusing it in some way, gluing it, adhesion, whatever. And so this is a very broad term, and for that reason, it is the largest section in the exhibition. But it really, again, shows from this very simple idea of, well, you know, what happens if we stick 2 materials together, we're getting these very intricate examples of what is possible. So the 3 pieces that we're looking at here, all from this section, the one on the far left is by John Buck, who splits his time between Hawaii and Montana. He is known for these carved wood assemblages, right? He is individually carving all of these pieces up to, the chain linking the figure and the tower on this. A lot of people assume that that's like a found object or a store-bought chain. That's actually, he's hand carving all of the links of that, and it is inserting into the tower here. And yes, I'm referring to this as the tower. This is American Babylon is the title of this piece. And so John Buck was trying to make this connection between the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, which is, of course, after the Great Flood, the people, according to the biblical myth, the people of Earth came together to build this tower that was supposed to reach the heavens. They were literally going to climb up, and they were just going to, skip the rat race and go right on up to heaven. God wasn't so happy with this, according to the myth, and basically struck the tower down, separated the people of Earth into different quadrants, and made them speak different languages so that they could never work together as productively as before. So John Buck is taking this this biblical story and is connecting it to, the kind of American mythos by literal connection here. We have a literal chain going from the top of the tower to the hand of the figure here. And you'll notice here that the figure is almost headless, but then you follow the kind of stepped stairway from where the neck of the figure would be all the way to the map of the United States behind the figure, and there's where you find this head. So this idea of this almost the grandiosity of kind of the American, the American hope, this almost manifest destiny-esque idea. John Buck is perhaps making a commentary about the kind of how unrealistic perhaps some of those expectations might be in some ways, but also connecting this to this long history of, big goals. And maybe there's something to be said for shooting for the big goals, even if they are failures, kind of like the Tower of Babel. But the construction of this is really pretty incredible. While it might look complex, there's actually a simple system of pins that actually hold this together. So the rake-like form that sits on top of the figure actually slots in with a wooden pin into the stair-stepped form that is going into the shoulder of the torso below. And that's the same method of construction that is actually holding on the stair step, and then a pin from the head on the American map is what is slotting into the other side of that. So it's just very beautifully counterbalanced. It's really interesting to see it from the side as well. All of these sculptures are, of course, meant to be viewed in the round. It's unfortunate, of course, due to the size of the space, some of things had to be backed up, but really do take the time to kind of see these from as many angles as you can, because it's a really rewarding experience. The next piece we're looking at here in the center is by Atulastanga, and this is Desolate Winds. This is another mixed media assemblage here, but it's painted wood, and we believe this to be this found wire mesh that he's using. So this is actually, the torso of this is made from this kind of found wood. It's carved, he's removed some of the bark, but the general shape of it is actually coming from the tree limbs themselves, and then he's adhering them and covering them in layers of paint and gesso to get this kind of prismatic paint scheme that unifies all these disparate elements, including the mesh, which is painted over, which you can't see very well here. The title of this leaves a lot up into interpretation, but it very much fits into the body of Atulastanga's work. He was working with a lot of kind of tortured saint figures, martyred saints, or tortured figures from mythology. So while this isn't linked directly to any of that kind of mythos, it's still very much fitting in this kind of tortured, twisted, agonized expression that is very much kind of coming across in the features and the body of this figure. And this is something, again, this combination of these found materials, like the found wood and the found wire mesh here, is very much indicative of Skanga's method of working. The figure on the right, the two figures on the right, I should say, we will all be very familiar with. Again, Vanessa German having had a recent exhibition here. I think that was in 2019. But I'm forgetting now. But this is We Are the Animals Are Us, which we were lucky enough to acquire for the Figge Collection. Another great example of assemblage, taking all these different found materials and putting them together in this really kind of unique way. This was made in 2017, and it actually in part came out of glassblowing experience that Vanessa German had worked alongside to actually create the crown or the headdress of the figure on the right, which is all blown glass. And then if you'll actually notice, bound to the torsos of these figures are little lozenges of blown glass as well. So they're all kind of tied into this kind of these central power figures that we're looking at. So we're all probably familiar with Vanessa German at this point. She works in the Homewood neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She's referencing this tradition of kind of power figures from African sculpture and African mythology. But she's incorporating all these elements from her neighborhood and things that she's finding. And she's always on this kind of searching mission to find more of these materials to incorporate into her works. And that was absolutely true of her time here as well. She was looking for materials. I believe she took like a glass bottle home with her that she was going to incorporate into her future pieces. There's a great bit on the back of the figure, I think it's the figure on the left here, where there's this wooden box, and if you read written on it, it says, "Please save for Vanessa." So obviously this is a box that she had wanted. She had seen that it sit in somewhere and wanted it noted to be left aside so that she can incorporate it in these in a future work. the construction of these is really interesting. So these are they're torsos. You can't really tell unless you're, unless you're removing bits, which you don't do that, but they're made out of plaster bandages. So if you've ever had, a leg cast or anything like that, I think they use slightly different materials now, but it's the same basic principle. It's a piece of cloth that is soaked in plaster, which is then wetted, and then you're able to drape it over an underlying form, in this case, I think there is an armature. They think some chicken wire, but the plaster will then harden as the curing process happens. And that is the basis for these. So they're, it's this rigid base, but they're also pretty fragile, but it's allowing her to actually puncture into these plaster bandages to actually tie all of these disparate elements, the moth, the mirror, the cast iron monkey on the shoulder, all that's being bound into the plaster underneath. So it makes for this really unified form. And she's talking about that too, in that she's always thinking about the underlying structure when she's assembling these things. She has this really great quote talking about her experience with sourcing these materials. I live in a neighborhood where there are many abandoned houses and vacant lots, but there's also lots of stuff everywhere. I love stuff, old stuff, rusty stuff, broken stuff. I gave myself permission to not be ashamed to just pick up stuff as I walked. I would carry extra bags with me to hold what I collected. And it's from this collection of broken stuff that Vanessa German is able to make these figures. Okay, so that's a little bit of what's going on in the assembly section. Another part of that same section is this work by Jane Gilmore, Jack's Weeds 2 here on the left. Jane Gilmore is, of course, having a exhibition here on the second floor as well, Breakfast on Pluto. So we thought it was really a great opportunity to get out the work of hers that is in the collection. This is obviously much earlier. This was made in 1988. It's part of her series where she was speaking to disenfranchised people who are maybe losing their homes or have been kicked out of their homes in some way. This particular gentleman named Jack, the writing, which you probably can't read on your screen here, it says, "I am so sorry to leave so many weeds. I had a stroke right at the wrong time. I wanted to leave it nice." And then it's signed Jack. So this is an actual note that was left in a house that someone was moving into. Lots of Jane's friends will give her notes that they find or notes that they find interesting, and then Jane will remake them in this technique, which I'll talk about in a second. But this whole series was about these people losing their connection to their home and what that kind of looked like on a personal level. The technique that Jane's actually using to recreate this man's letter is really a form of chasing a repoussé, which some of you may be familiar with. It's basically taking a sheet of metal and then pounding it or embossing it from either side in order to get this kind of sculptural form. Traditionally, this would have been done on top of like a leather bag, and then you would have been pounding it from both sides to either emboss it or get the sculptural shape and dimension you want and define things more and more clearly and refining it as you go on. Jane has really refined this to use it in a very, so she's using these very thin sheets of copper that are coated in this, I believe it's shiny aluminum, that is soft enough. It's only a couple degrees thicker than the thickest aluminum foil that you would use in your house, but it has enough strength and rigidity to kind of hold this shape but still be malleable. So Jane is able to take these sheets, put them on top of a sheet of cardboard, and just using kind of a dull stylus is able to write on top of these, and it leaves the embossing of the letters. She's then taking India ink, coating the entire surface, letting it dry, and abrading it with steel wool. And the abrasion is what is revealing the silver underneath and leaving the black in the recesses of the embossing that she's done. Some of the other two materials here, this is obviously a shovel handle that she's included on the bottom. The pinnacle at the top of where the writing is actually made out of a sheet of asphalt. So it's something that you would use for roofing or shingles, which very appropriate at the top of the form there. And this kind of, Jane is always on the lookout for, again, in a similar way to Vanessa German, always sourcing new materials. Okay, the piece on the far right is probably the one I should talk about next. This is by Aurora Robson. This is a piece that is completely made out of pop bottles, which is really incredible. This is called Ganglia. all of Aurora Robson is about kind of our relationship to plastic, and specifically our relationship to the plastic in terms of what's doing to the oceans. So she often she talks about it here, this is a quote from her. She says, all of her works are comprised of plastic debris that I've hand manipulated and transformed into miniature composites of a nightmare landscape that haunted me as a child, wherein forms morph into one another from chaotic meandering knots. Each component in these pieces has been individually cut by my hands, then airbrushed with non-toxic tinted polyacrylic and mica powder. Which is like a natural mineral stone powder. It's basically like fancy glitter. It's giving the kind of shimmery surface to these pop bottles here. And if you look at this closely, you can really tell that they're still pop bottles. And you know, this relationship between the material, plastic bottles, and this kind of oceanic imagery that permeates Robson's work, you know, people think of like the trash island and things like that. There's an obvious connection to kind of what's going on environmentally that Robson is making a reference to. But I think this is really interesting in terms of what you can do with a simple material that would otherwise be waste, in this case, pop bottles. And then all she's using is an X-Acto knife and then some pop rivets, which is, anyone's used a pop rivet gun. It's incredibly simple. You literally put the little tab in the end of the gun, put it between two pieces of plastic in this case, squeeze it, it expands, and that's what fuses the pieces of material together. Now, a little bit more complicated in terms of, here's where we get to using assembly very broadly. The middle piece here is, of course, the leg splint by the Eameses. This was a piece that was made, really their first foray, Charles and Ray Eames, was their first foray into wood bending. So this was made in 1942, and it was a commission by the United States Navy because they needed something that was both form-fitted enough to support the leg, but also incredibly light. Well, the Eameses had already been, Charles and Ray Eames had already been working with with bent wood, but they hadn't yet perfected it. Well, the resources of the United States military was enough to kind of get them to where they needed to be able to produce something like this. So wood bending has been around, you know, thousands of years. The Vikings did it, etc. The innovation of the Eameses was the incorporation of plywood. Plywood was a fairly new technology. There was this great ad that MoMA quoted in talking about the creation of plywood, where they referred to it as a layer cake of lumber and glue, which I think is a fantastic way to describe it. But because of these layers of basically wood veneer in between glue, they are able to be more malleable than traditional lumber would be. You're able to bend it more, and that's where the steam comes in. So you're introducing steam because it kind of relaxes the natural bonds of the wood, and it's going to allow it to compress. You're not really stretching wood much when you do wood bending. You are really just allowing it to condense on the inside of the curve. And to do this, so you would introduce a piece of plywood, you would introduce steam into the atmosphere around the piece of plywood, and you would then almost stretch it or pull it over a hardwood form, or you can use steel or other materials as well, and pull it over the form until the steam kind of evaporates out of it. And once the steam is gone, the rigidity of the wood is back, and then it'll hold that form. The kind of biomorphic forms that the Eameses were recreating in these leg splints are exactly the kind of, you know, body-hugging biomorphic forms that you will see in later iterations of their furniture, like their chairs and so forth. And actually, throughout the rest of the war, they went on to continue to use this kind of bent wood technique to make parts for airplanes, which is pretty incredible. So one of the things that you'll see throughout the entire exhibition is that there are a lot of pieces by, you know, outsider artists, you know, folk artists, art brut, this concept of artists who aren't necessarily making art for the art market, or aren't necessarily even thinking of themselves as artists, and aren't necessarily trained in the, you know, traditional way. They're not necessarily going to school for art. That doesn't mean they're unskilled. It means that they're being trained, you know, as a carver, or they might be trained as a tinsmith. And so that's really on display throughout the entirety of the exhibition. A lot of the examples I have on the screen here are from the assembly section, with the exception of the weather vane at the bottom right, which is in carving. But to give you an example, several of these pieces might have been created as kind of displays of the craftsman's skill. The Titanic at bottom left is an excellent example of that. We think this was a kind of a tinsmith's model to kind of demonstrate what his skills were. Other examples might have been, advertisement or something like that. The folk art chain at the top left was quite possibly that. This thing, I really recommend looking at it in person. It's actually reticulated so that this chain is not constantly in this position. They figured out how to carve the individual links in such a way that, you obviously can't do this, but if those gears turned, the chain would continue to loop around them. It's malleable, which is incredibly impressive. Of course, we have the whirligig at center here. This was, of course, meant to spin by the power of the wind. The arms would have flailed around what we assume might be George Washington here, based on the blue suit. And then, of course, we have this whimsical bicycle here that is actually meant to be pedal driven and not the traditional way, where instead you would push straight down on the pedals, and somehow that would change the cogs of the gears to push the bike tires. Of course, all of this was a simulation. This bike could never be ridden, but it was kind of a whimsical idea of what a bicycle could be. And all of these too have this thing that's really inherent to a lot of the folk art of, a lot of these are from the 19-teens, 1920s, but a lot of them have these kind of beautiful patinas on them from being left out in the elements all these years. And that's particularly true of something like the weather vane at the bottom right, which is a little earlier. It's probably from the 19th century, but this would have been painted in its entirety when it was originally made, but now the elements of water, wind, and rain have kind of, which I guess water and rain are the same thing, but the elements have really eroded away the surface of it, and not only just the paint surface, but also part of the surface of the wood, giving it this kind of beautiful gray pitted patina. Okay. All right, so the next section, and I should have mentioned too, folk art is not a defined section within the exhibition. It's just something that you're going to find examples of or outsider art within all of the different sections of the exhibition. Okay, the next section that you move into walking through the exhibition going clockwise would be the modeling portion of the exhibition. Modeling, again, we're using that as a very broad term to talk about any material that is kind of plastic enough to be formed by the human hand into a shape. Within the Figge collection, that most oftentimes is being applied to ceramics. So ceramics, you're using clay, molding it into a shape, and then firing it in a kiln so it has rigidity. That's very basic. We'll dive into the more specifics of how some of these are made, looking at the individual objects. The piece on the far left, this is by Marlene Miller. This is girl number one. So this is actually two separate pieces of stoneware. The girl comes off. She is sitting on top of this log, which is basically a log base, because the platform on which the girl is standing actually comes off with her. Interestingly enough, a lot of ceramics that we'll look at or are within the collection have glazes on them. These are actually being covered in oil paint, so it's a little bit different finish. She's doing something pretty interesting in terms of the way that she's working with her stoneware, is that she is letting it, she's using I believe a coil method. So coil method is you're rolling this into basically a snake that's usually like a 1/2 inch in diameter, layering up, hundreds of layers of that coil on top of itself, smoothing both sides of it so that it unifies the coil into these solid walls that we're looking at. And the reason that you're doing this, and the reason you use any of the different kind of methods of clay construction, is because you can't really leave solid chunks of clay in the kiln, because they'll explode because of the heat, the change in heat. But if you have a hollow inside, you can create large forms and not have them explode. And so by using the coil technique, she's then allowing it to dry to leather hard, and all that means is letting it selectively dry out so that it's as malleable as leather would be. She's then actually chopping off the various appendages, so the arms and legs, and contorting them into the kind of gesture that she wants. So she's able to manipulate these things even at kind of a late stage in the sculpting process, which isn't kind of an innovative way of working with the clay. The center artist is also being very innovative in his approach to clay. This is Adolf Rosenblatt. This is Kids Making Art. Adolf Rosenblatt was a Milwaukee-based ceramicist who was, famous for capturing scenes in Milwaukee life that were either, kind of little known or little appreciated, or had been kind of consumed by the growth of the city itself. So these little vignettes of life that were being swallowed up. We actually have a different piece in the collection that many of you will have seen called Imperial Motors, which is this huge automotive garage. And that's maybe more of his more typical vignettes. But this Kids Making Art was another one of his pieces that we had recently received in the collection that had never been on view. So we thought this was a great opportunity to get it out. You can actually see his hand, literally the impression of his fingers in some of the components of these bodies. And so he's making these almost pretty solid. And the reason that he's able to do that is because a lot of these pieces aren't necessarily kiln fired, or not kiln fired to the same high temperature. So they're just being allowed to kind of dry out, and then he's not putting glazes on them. He's just using, again, a painted surface. We think it's probably oil paint on the surface here. So an innovative way of dealing with this. And it should be noted too that he's kind of taking this whimsical approach to ceramics in a lot of different facets. You'll notice the figure on the right, the floor doesn't quite line up. And the reason that is because she's actually on kind of a lazy Susan. So you can pivot her whatever way you want. Obviously, you can't do any of this when you're visiting the exhibition, but there was this option allowed in the display of her, depending which way you would wanted her to face. Something else too is that the drawings that the child on the left is making are actually interchangeable. So he provided several different options for what you could kind of put in front of her, as though she'd almost kind of come to life and completed her own sketch there. The piece on the right is by Susan and Stephen Kamenefi. They both, went to the University of Iowa. Susan was studying printmaking under Mauricio Lazansky. Stephen was studying ceramics, obviously. They realized that there was this kind of opportunity for a synthesis between their works. There was this great quote from Susan, where she says, Stephen was doing a lot of ceramics and he hated doing the surfaces. So he said, why don't you keep drawing on some of these pieces? And that is how we started. So it's just this simple, like, I don't want to do the surface design. You can do the surface design. You obviously love that. I'll create the forms. And he's using raku pottery here, but he's using a slab method. So what that means is you're actually rolling out the clay till it's, again, about a ½ inch thick, and it's rolling it out like you would roll out pie dough. To get a consistent ½ inch, basically, thickness throughout. And then you're able to actually, stand that on its end and fuse the edges of it to make the kind of lozenge-shaped form that he has here with the side walls. And then he's adding, obviously, this kind of column capital embellishment on the top as well. So it's a very simple form that Susan is then going back in and drawing into with a stylus. And then they're actually by using raku, they're able to get some really interesting surface designs because they're allowing the rapidly cooling raku clay contracts, and that's where they're getting things like you can see there's little crazing or cracks on the hand of the figure. That's not damage. That's something that they intentionally wanted there, and that's achieved through the rapid temperature change in the raku itself, allowing for this cracking of the glaze itself. And it makes pretty dramatic color shifts as well. Okay. Two more examples of modeling here. The piece on the left is by Paul Soldner, excuse me. This is another example where I believe he's using not only coil method to build the center of the pot here, but then using slab to actually embellish it in terms of the foot, which is the base of the vessel, and then the lip, as well as a big sheet of slab-built clay, excuse me. Soldner, what he was perhaps most famous for was his innovative approach to raku rakuware, which is what this is. He was known for taking his wet slabs and impressing into them all sorts of various material, including, masonite forms, automobile tires, car tires. Also, he would take things like dead carp and shove them in there as well, so that there would be this impression of the fish scales onto the ceramic ware. And then he was able to accentuate that with the kind of dramatic surfaces that he was creating in these black and white finishes. Again, really playing with his material in an innovative way that is only really possible sometimes in clay. And there's elements of that in this work at the Figge. You can see where he's impressed what I believe might be corrugated cardboard into the surface, especially of the lip and the foot, the top and bottom. Okay, obviously the piece on the right by Jean Graham, called Autumn Pot number 9, is of course being coil bit. In this case, the coils are being left intact, not necessarily being smoothed together. So you really get a good example of the technique. But you can see inside, it's obviously been smoothed so that it all is blending together in such a way that it's going to hold. So a good example of the coil technique. I'm gonna move on so I don't run out of time. The next section that we look at in the exhibition is casting. So again, using the term very broadly here, casting is where you are taking something that you've made out of another material, making a mold out of it, so covering it in a material, often plaster, but you can use other materials for mold making, of course. And then you are removing your original thing that you had made, and you are pouring a different material into that recess that then solidifies and becomes a new version of that original form that you had made. Now that's very broad. It is not at all, the ends of what is possible with mold making. A lot of modern mold making is being done with silicone rubber, is being done with plastics and resins. And so that's just a very broad, it's a similar process, but the materials are, very interchangeable. The reason I wanted to show you this case is I think this is a really good, so that all three of these objects are in the same case in the back of the Figge exhibition. Obviously, the one on the right looks too big to fit in the case. I'll explain that in a second. But these three pieces are all made within like 30 years of each other. They are all cast bronze using the lost wax process. They're all using the figure, for inspiration. However, their interpretation of that figurative inspiration has led them to very different endpoints, even though they're working in similar time periods using the exact same material, using the same technique. And I think that's really the strength of an exhibition like this, is you're able to make those comparisons across, style, across time period, across, different technique, well, same technique, but different kind of visual ways of working. So the piece on the far left is by Barbara Lechberg. This is a piece called Lazarus, of course, from the biblical story of Lazarus rising from the dead. We see it, Lazarus kind of literally kicking off his shroud here. A lot of Lechberg's pieces are done in this kind of shrouded method. They're figures that are covered in some kind of cloth. This is amongst the most figurative of the bronzes in this case. So it's showing a progression from like the most figurative with Lechberg here to slightly less figurative with someone like Jean Arp in the center, which is Pistol. Jean Arp will be probably one of the more famous names in this exhibition, a huge member of the Surrealists. Although not necessarily always working with dreamlike imagery, Arp was more concerned with capturing movement. There's this interesting quote. He says, "I draw things that recline, drift, rise, ripen, fall. I model fruits that lie still, clouds that drift on and up, stars that grow ripe and drop, symbols of the eternal transformation into infinite peace." So from that, you gather that it's all, it's about movement, it's about transition. And a lot of Arp's pieces are really about often the female form in a state of movement. So as you walk around this piece, and again, it's a little unfortunate that it had to be in a vitrine, but as you walk around it, you get a sense of this kind of undulating figure underneath of this kind of almost, I don't know, to get a little poetic, like bronze prison almost, that they're sticking elbows or limbs or body parts out, almost kind of trying to break free from this form that Arp has put them in. But this undulating movement is what Arp is all about. The piece on the far right, okay, as I mentioned, this is obviously a huge sculpture. This is actually the 120-inch, full scale. This is Clement Mead Moore's Sophisticated Lady. The one that we have in the case is the Sophisticated Lady maquette. They're both technically part of the City of Davenport art collection, which we house here. So we have the maquette in the case. If you want to see the real thing, it is in Davenport. It is at the D. Bremer Public Works building in Davenport, so you can go see it there. But again, taking figurative inspiration and, in the maquette, which is only about 4 inches tall, working out the kind of gesture of what that figurative element will look like when transformed into these kind of extruded rectangles. And then being able to take that small maquette and, blow it up 100 and, to 180 inches from 4 inches. It's a good way of showing how a sculptor will work from very small to, massive public art monuments, which is what Mead Moore was really dedicated to, making art available to the public. So doing a large scale piece like this is, of course, perfectly in fitting with his body of work. Okay, 2 more works from within the casting section. This piece on the left is by Douglas Abdel. This is a curated. So the reason I'm struggling with that, it's the the language of the title is actually a made-up language, and it's actually what Abdel is thinking through here. It's a combination of Italian and Lebanese, which are also the 2 parts of Abdel's heritage. He made up a language combining those 2 languages, and from that he wrote poetry which inspired these works, and then wrote poetry inspired by these works. But it's actually some of the lettering that he makes up for this made-up language that are actually populating the outside surface of the piece in the Figge collection on the left. So that's where you're getting these little kind of undulating forms that are sticking out from the surface of this tripod shape. Again, this is both. I selected these 2 to be on the same slide because it's an example of, both of these are bronze again, both of them using lost wax casting, but very, very different end results. The piece on the right is by Carl Genuine. This is Child and Dolphin. I wanted to use this piece to talk a little bit about the lost wax process, and I will run through it incredibly quickly because I know I'm running out of time. To make something like this, Genuine would have started with a clay core, from which he would have made the kind of overall design, obviously with an armature to kind of hold up the clay initially. He would have then covered that entire surface with wax, and from the wax he would be able to carve the kind of minute detail that might not necessarily been as easy in the clay form, and also the nature of wax is going to come into play later. He would have then stuck pins in throughout the entire surface to kind of hold the clay core in place after as the mold is being made. There would have been a surrounding mold, either plaster or, as this illustration suggested, could have been clay, probably plaster, that you would then heat up. The wax would then flow out of the mold. You can also make the surrounding mold out of other things as well. The wax surrounding the clay core would have melted out, leaving a chasm that you could then pour the molten bronze into, and it would take in the recess, which would leave you with just a hollow, because then you can remove the clay core that had started the whole process after the bronze cools. Now that's very generalized. There's a lot of steps that I've glazed over, but that's kind of the basis of how you're getting these hollowed bronze forms. And the reason they're making them hollow is for twofold. Bronze is exceedingly expensive to cast, being a copper alloy of copper and tin, but it's also exceedingly heavy. So they wanted to, make it cheaper and lighter, and so you make it hollow. I should mention, Genuine was, this was made in the 1930s. This is kind of indicative of the kind of thing he did. He did a lot of architectural decoration. In this case, this would have been a fountain. In fact, this is a piece that would have greeted a lot of visitors to the old Davenport Museum of Art building as you came in. Would have been one of the first pieces you would have seen. Okay, our last section, and I will try and do double time so that we get you all out of here by 7:30. Carving is, of course, using the very general broad umbrella term here. We have a lot of examples of different materials in here, from stone to metal to, and there's all different techniques as well. And I'll explain some of that here, but it's basically just anything that's using a reductive process, anything where you are using oftentimes a sharp implement to remove material. And that's the general umbrella that we have used for carving here. here we have a recent example of a recent addition to the collection, excuse me. This is a violin by Mattis Norkus. So Mattis Norkus was a Latvian immigrant to this area who was actually sponsored by V.O. Figge, and would be doing these kind of amazing carvings in his basement, doing this kind of parquetry and marquetry. Marquetry being the kind of figural birds that we have here, and the parquetry being the kind of geometric Latvian designs that we have in terms of like the snowflakes and the almost the grid work or the lattice work at the bottom between the two birds. But it's the system of inlay that he created is really quite meticulous and beautiful. So he's taking these very thin sheets of veneer, carving into them to create recesses that he can put then these thin pieces of what I believe is ebony veneer into the recesses to make this solid decoration. And according to his grandson, he was doing these carvings and this marquetry work using kitchen utensils. So things like the carving knife would be missing, and supposedly, Norkus's wife would holler down to him in the workshop in the basement, asking him to bring the carving knife back. I don't necessarily believe that this was made with a kitchen knife. It seems way too fine of work for that, but it's a great story nonetheless. So from this, not hobbyist, but someone who is working in outside of the art world, to someone like Michael Peterson, who is very much, a trained sculptor, but still working kind of unconventionally. Michael Peterson made the piece on the right, which is called New Terrain, and it's carved and pigmented Madrona burl wood. So Madrona burl wood, it means it's coming from the root burl. That's where so there's a complex kind of net of grain that's happening here that's going to allow for his process, which I'll explain. So what he's doing, he's taking this chunk of burl, he is carving it using a chainsaw into this kind of rectilinear board that he is then hollowing out a recess. You can see the entirety of this board has been hollowed out inside. And then through a process of kind of kiln drying, the complex net of grain is forcing this thing to twist as it's drying, not only twist, but also compress in on itself as this kind of moisture evaporates in the kiln. And that's actually part of the way it's attached to the metal armature below, is that the wood has kind of sucked in around the metal rods that you see in the bottom. It does have a hook that helps to hold it up, but the rod, I think it's the rod on the right, is actually just pinched in between the layers of wood. And so he's making this perfect rectangle, and then nature is kind of twisting it, which is kind of incredible. Okay. Continuing on with carving, we have a piece on the left, many of you by Serge Jalame. Of course, we're very familiar with Haitian metalwork here, having such a great Haitian collection. We couldn't not include it in this section. It is an example of carving. Of course, they're using scrap metal, either from automobile parts, or in this case, most likely an oil drum. There's actually a great seam in the center of this where you can see where it's about the right width for two sections of oil drum to be butted up against each other. And so the process for this, they're flattening out the found metal they have, by pounding it flat. And then they are taking white chalk. Serge Jalame is taking white chalk and drawing the outline of the figures onto it, and using a chisel to pound through the metal and cutting through these recesses, and then filing the recesses in such a way that they are smooth. And then going back in and doing the great kind of little embossing by hammering from the back to get things like the texture that we see on like the arm of the sorceress on the left. This is called the two sorceresses. And so the sorceress on the left has the embossing that I'm talking about. So that's, again, very quick through the process there. Another kind of innovative approach to carving. And actually, this is an example of one of the transition pieces in the exhibition. I have this at the intersection of casting and carving, because John Ahern, a Bronx-based sculptor in New York, who is doing these life casts, is also carving into them. So this is both casting and carving. And there's different transition pieces like that in most of the sections of the exhibition, whether it be, ceramics that are also cast, or examples like this where it's a casting that's also carved. So he's actually John Ahern is using actually alginate, which is it's derived from seaweed. It's a powder that you would actually use for dental molding it well. So you may quite possibly have had alginate in your mouth at some point, because it's a powder you're mixing with water, and it makes a mold that is safe to put on your skin. It's not going to heat up, and but the problem is that you can only use it once, because after you've done your first casting, it's going to break apart, and also it immediately begins to shrink as the water evaporates. So Ahern is taking the material and smearing it all over the face of his models here. Since he's doing the facial mold, he would have to have probably straws into their nose to actually allow for them to breathe while this is happening. But it's amazing in the amount of detail that this material can cast. You're getting things like the pores of the skin, the individual hairs on someone, which does hurt a little bit when it comes off, honestly. But you're able, Ahern is taking that, and there are elements of where you can see the pores on the hands of, this is called Big Chief here. And then he has the pores, but then he's abrading it. So it's this mesh of this perfect casting, but then reintroducing the artist's hand into it. And of course, he's emphasizing that further by painting on top of them. These figures. Here's a little shot of how we kind of figured out the layout. We do scale mock-ups for a lot of these exhibitions. That was particularly true in this exhibition, because we had to really make sure that everything was going to fit, because a lot of these things are delicate, should only be moved once, and are pretty heavy in some instances as well. So we wanted to be really sure. So this is the scale mock-up. Here's an image of the installation. And then here's some images of the laid out exhibition, but really none of these photographs do it justice. I really, I insist that you all come and see it in person, because with a sculpture exhibition, even perhaps more so than with 2D work, the images just can't do it justice. It does look like I have one question in the chat. If anyone has any remaining questions, I know I've kept you past time. Feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A real quick, but otherwise, I will, just thank you all for being here. And if you do have any, remaining lingering questions that I didn't blather on about incessantly, I encourage you all to, send me an email, and I'll be happy to respond just as soon as I can. But all right, I don't think I have any other questions, so I'll thank you all for coming, and I'll see you guys at the next program. Bye.